Hi everybody, welcome to our last WISM talk of the semester. We're excited to have two very special presenters today, Ricardo González and Sergio Chaigneau from University of Adolfo Ibañez
Yes.
in Chile, talking about some innovative methods with respect to semantic analysis. So I'll just turn it over to our presenters now. Ricardo and Sergio, please take it away.
Okay,
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, please share the screen.
And I'm on it.
Yeah, it's getting there. Yes. Okay. So good morning, good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Luke for giving us the opportunity to speak to you today. It's a pleasure to be here among such distinguished guests. My name is Ricardo González. I'm a survey researcher with 10 years of experience in both academic and private sector positions. Currently, I'm the founder and executive director of LEAS at the School of Communications and Journalism at University of Adolfo Ibañez in Chile. I also serve on the expert advisory board of NORC's Center for Panel Survey Science. And I was honored last year. I received this Wayport's Alexis de Tocqueville Award. So I work in public opinion mostly. At LEAS, we focus on measuring social change in Chile by developing new methods in survey research. Today, we will introduce a method you might not be familiar with, adapted from experimental cognitive psychology for studying social groups. For that reason, joining me in this project and today is Sergio Chaigneau, a cognitive psychologist with a PhD from Emory University, supervised by Larry Barcelo. Sergio conducts experimental research on causal reasoning and categorization. And he also develops tools to explore the structure of semantic knowledge and its interactions with the cognitive system. Next slide, please. The work you will see today is the result of a collaborative effort, not just by Sergio and me, but by a small team at the School of Psychology and the Faculty of Engineering and Sciences. Some of them are here. I see them in the audience. So they have been instrumental in several dimensions of our current project. So we start by thanking them for their contributions, as well as the James McDonald Foundation, which funded their work. However, the data collection for the results we're going to present today was funded by LEAS. So next slide, please. So today we're going to explore a critical issue that is impacting the foundation of our democracies, not just in North America and Western Europe, but also in Latin America and especially in Chile. We're focusing on the changing perceptions of democracy, particularly among younger generations. An important study by Fo and Monk in 2016 has brought to light a significant decline in the appreciation for democracy. This isn't just about people being unhappy with their political leaders. This seems to be running deeper. It questions the very system of democracy itself. And this isn't just a difference in opinion between the young and the old. This research suggests what we call a cohort effect. On your right, you can see the figure I took from Fo and Monk's work. The figure shows that back in 1995, only 16% of Americans born in the 1970s viewed democracy as a bad system for the country. And fast forward 20 years, and this number had risen to a bit more than 20% within the same group. The following generation, those born in the 1980s, showed even stronger anti-democratic sentiments. By 2011, 24% of US millennials considered democracy to be a bad or very bad way to run the country. And in Europe, the situation was somewhat less stark, but still remarkable. In 2011, 13% of young Europeans, aged 16 to 24, held a negative view of democracy, up from 8% in the mid-1990s. So these numbers paint a clear picture. Millennials display significantly less enthusiasm for democracy compared to older generations. Next slide, please. And on your right, you'll see a chart. This chart is similar to the one created by Fo and Monk for the US and Western Europe. However, this chart focuses on Chile, drawing data from the World Value Service, specifically waves 3 and 7. And let's take a closer look at the numbers. In 2018, 26% of Chilean millennials, those aged 18 to 29, viewed democracy as a bad or very bad way to govern the country. This was an increase from 16% back in the mid-1990s. So this data suggests that, well, it reflects a global pattern and highlights a widening generational divide in how Chileans of different ages perceive democracy. Next slide, please. So these findings suggest that democracy is backsliding, not just globally, but also here in Chile. But let's pause for a moment. What do we mean by democratic backsliding? To truly understand this concept, we must first know how people define democracy themselves. And a recent systematic review in 2023 by Koenig and colleagues shows that most studies, 81 out of 98 studies reviewed, begin by setting their own definitions of what democracy should be. These studies use specific, close-ended survey questions, assuming that everyone, no matter where they come from or what their personal experiences are, thinks about democracy in the same way. But the question is this assumption correct? Perhaps not. And the other thing is that these studies typically explore only about 1.5 to 1.7 concepts of democracy on average. This narrow range suggests that our current research might not fully capture the diverse ways in which people actually think about and experience democracy. Next slide, please. And out of the studies reviewed, only 17 out of 19 articles use open-ended questions to learn about citizens' views on democracy, according to the same study. However, the answers to these questions are usually organized in one of two ways, either by grouping them together based on themes as they appear, or by sorting them into preset categories. One major problem with categorizing responses is that it forces people's opinions into specific boxes, which might not fully represent their views. Additionally, simply reporting these responses as numbers or percentages of mentions doesn't show how different views on democracy might relate to each other, which I think it's critical because, well, you would be missing out on several and different understandings of what democracy means to different people. So this emphasizes the need for a new approach to fully understand how people perceive democracy. And this way, we, as researchers, can provide a more accurate explanation of what democratic backsliding really means. Next slide, please. So to gain a deeper understanding of how people perceive democracy, we use the word association task, a method adapted from experimental cognitive psychology to study social groups. And the approach is very, very, very simple. That's why I said at the beginning that I see so much potential on this for public opinion researchers. This is very simple. Participants are asked to list words or word combinations that come to mind when thinking of a target concept. In this case, democracy. Now, Sergio is going to explain the assumptions underlying this approach, how it can be used to explore semantic memory for social concepts like democracy, and compare it with data from a different project his team is working on, focused on the concept nature. Then Sergio is going to describe how we put this approach to work using a Chilean sample of respondents divided by age groups. We calculate several indexes, coverage, valence, list similarity, and heat maps, and explore what Chileans of different ages mean by democracy. It's important to note that our work is still in the early stages. We're just beginning to process the data and refine our methods for studying perceptions. And finally, we conclude by discussing limitations and future work. So now I'll hand it over to you, Sergio.
Okay, thanks, Ricardo. Jump in whenever you find it necessary. So the basic idea is that we can find shared semantic memory, which is the way we understand meaning, shared meaning in people, and that this shared semantic memory has consequences for behavior. So this is true for concrete objects. Like you see there a graph that shows similarity between concrete objects, and we simply asked people to tell us what properties or features objects have. And when you process that information, trying to find similarity between different concepts, you find that people do list common features, so common properties. Like you get artifacts like hammer, screwdriver, knife, all together, means of transportation. So you find that there's a common ground that is shared across people. This is true for concrete objects. It's also true for abstract concepts like stereotypes. People have common knowledge about stereotypes, and they have consequences for behavior. So generally, it's believed that prejudiced behavior follows the existence of stereotypes rather than the other way around. So that's the general idea. And now there must be some conditions for this semantic shared semantic memory to develop. There's got to be some stable structuring factors of your memory. In laboratory settings, this is because people are trained and they learned list of words or learned something, which afterwards they have to report. But in natural environments, people have a common perceptual experience. For example, the experience of seeing a dog, a common linguistic and cultural environment, how you talk about certain things. And this is generally assumed to be true. Nobody doubts that it's true about concrete concepts like dog, cat, and desk. But they can also operate on abstract concepts like stereotypes and emotions, for which are pretty much abstract concepts, and people do share content for that. So we believe that they should also apply to other concepts which might be more interesting for social researchers, like nature, climate change, or democracy. So just as stereotypes, these concepts seem to be influenced by social group, current cultural dynamics, and they have cognitive and emotional components that correlate with behavior. Not that this is an easy task, because abstractions pose several problems for researchers, but generally this should be the case. You should be able to find common grounds for concepts like democracy. So the basic assumption, because we're using, like Ricardo was explaining, the word association task, and in that task, people simply tell you things that come to mind when they think about democracy in our case, or nature. And so we are assuming that when people inspect or look in their semantic memory to create the report that the list that they're reporting, things that come close in their lists tend to come close from the same area that they're searching in their memory. So, for example, if you're asking for a list of animals, and you give them 30 seconds to list as many animals as you can think, then dog and cat will tend to come close in their lists. So we're assuming that, well, not only are they frequent in their experience, but they are conceptualized similarly. So when they jump to another place in their memory to search, they'll go to African animals, and they'll list zebra and wildebeest and lion, and those come from the same area of search. So from their lists, we can derive knowledge about the structure of their semantic memory. And the second assumption that we have is, to the extent that people belong to a true social group, which is a group that's subject to the same environment and social conditions, then their lists should be able to be combined into a representative list. For us, a representative list is things that naturally form associations in their way of conceptualizing, in our case, democracy or nature. So as Ricardo was explaining, the word association task has several advantages. First, ease of collection. So it's really fast. People will, in a minute, produce the list that you can process. It's a natural question to ask, not like many experimental tasks where people have to read instructions and understand the setting of the experiment and probably be pre-trained before answering. Here you can simply ask, tell me all the things, that words or word combinations that come to mind when you think of democracy. And people will just, you set them off and they'll start. Some will list 2, 3, others will list 5 or 10 or more, even more. But that's but the task is easy to do, and we want to show you here some methods of analysis that to extract information about both qualitative and quantitative information about the lists that they produce. So our sample is was collected through the Qualtrics web-based survey, and we targeted Chilean adults, 18 years and old, and old, 18 years of age and older, and they freely provided variable lists length of things that they associate with democracy and nature, both things. And this is a non-probabilistic sample, and the idea is to try to capture the diverse sample in terms of age, educational level, and geographic area in which they live. So we're focusing on basically on young, which means for us 18 to 34 years of age, and old participants 55 and over, but we also have an intermediate group that we'll be telling you about later on. So the tools that we're using, just to give you a very fast summary of this, we'll go into more details shortly. First tool is coverage, which is loosely speaking the percent of shared semantic memory, both including idiosyncratic content that people might produce. So some people would list corruption associated with democracy, but probably very few people or just a group of people would do that. And most people will list voting or president or representativeness in terms when listing for democracy. But we have a way of computing, of estimating how much of the total content that it's available out there in that group we're getting in our sample. The other tool that we're using is valence, which is from an independent study. We get average subjective ratings of positive or negative emotional valence on a 9-point scale. So for president, we have a score that tells you how positive or negative is the perception that people on average have about that concept. Then we have a measure of similarity, which is the distance that two words have in a list. So if dog and cat tend to come close together, they would have maximal similarity. And if zebra and dolphin never come together in a list, then they'll have a maximal distance. So we can this is with the assumption that if they come close together in the list, then they come from the same area of search in people's semantic memory. And then we use clustering and heat maps to reflect the association strength and learn something about the qualitative organization of the content that people are producing. Please, if you have questions for clarification, go and ask them. Otherwise, we'll leave the questions for the end of the talk. So coverage is an estimate. There's the formula, an estimate about how complete is is the content that we are getting relative to the total positive total content that we could get. So the basic intuition is here in the formula that the Q1, which are the singletons, words that are produced by a single person, and doubletons, words that are produced by only two people in the sample, two individuals. Then if Q1, the singletons approach 0, then you're getting close to full coverage of the content. So it's the same intuition that they have in qualitative research, which is theoretical saturation, which is when you're getting repetitions, then probably you've sampled enough. So if people start to mentioning, you just start to get the same ideas mentioned over and over again. So, but this is a formalization coming from ecological studies. So that's one thing that we have. So we want to have relatively high coverages and similar coverages for the groups that we're comparing. This is because the singletons you can think of singletons as noise in your data. So when you have a lot of noise, then your conclusions are difficult or are iffy. So we want to have relatively high coverages. We still don't have a formal way to define what is high coverage. We estimate like 70% maybe currently, but this is just a lot of guesswork into that. But we want relatively high coverages and similar coverages across our groups. Then we have a valence, which is this average subjective ratings, which were collected in an independent study. There's a small industry of collecting this kind of information. So there's a lot of available. This is for over 14,000 Spanish words, but there's in several languages now. People want to use them to study emotion, basically. Then we have our measure of least similarity, which goes in between runs between 0 and 1, with 1 meaning that both words always comes in direct proximity in subjects lists. So dog and cat, imagine that everybody mentions them close by, or senator and president. Maybe people always mention them in close or direct proximity. They would have a high value of similarity. And words that are mentioned that are never mentioned together in the list, they would have a 0 value. So if only one person mentions one word, one specific word, that the word would have a 0 similarity value with all the words in the study. So the good thing about this is that we can estimate similarity directly from lists. There are other methods that you could use, but they're significantly more costly in terms of time. For example, you might give someone 20 words and ask them to give you similarity ratings. So you'd say, how similar is president to senator, or how similar is dog to cat, if you were asking for animals, and they'll give you a rating. If you want to do that for 20 words, you could estimate that people will take over an hour. Think they have to understand instructions, they have to, there's a setup time and everything, that it's over an hour. In contrast, the word association test takes typically less than a minute for each participant. So we're sacrificing here maybe precision in terms of that. Our similarity estimates might be more rough, but we're gaining on the possibility of using these tasks and tools in natural environments, so we could get data really fast. So the pipeline, the analysis pipeline is just to give you a sense of the whole picture. We produced, people produce the list of words that are associated with democracy. We collect the lists, analyze coverage. If we have a very low coverage, we might get more subjects, so we can estimate how representative our data is, and it's not representative in the technical traditional sense, in the sense of completeness. Then we compute the valence for each subject. So if we can see if subjects have a more positive emotional tone relative to the concept or not. We can compute the distances to estimate similarity, and we can use that to do more traditional processing, which is clustering and heat maps, to try to find out which are the clusters of words or concepts that are representative of a certain group. So we would expect to get some specific results for one group, which will be different from another group. That's what we hope for. So this is data for coverage. for democracy. So we have young adults and older subjects listing. The T is the number of subjects for which we got the data. And these, the ones that are highlighted, are the coverages that we estimate for democracy. So around 80% of coverage, which means that if we get a larger sample, then there's not much space to get more content or different content. So with this estimates that we're getting sufficient of the data that we're looking for. And this is for nature, people listing for nature, the same three groups, young, adults, and older. And we also get 80 or above 80% of coverage. Just to remind you, this depends critically on the number of singletons, the Q1 value there. You can see from the equation that is, as Q1 approaches 0, then this whole equation gets closer to 1, which is full coverage. So that's the basic intuition behind the equation. And this is our valence analysis for the data. Though this is we have only here the young and older group. So this is to 18 to 34 and 55 and above. The older group, and the black line. Also, I mean the dark points correspond to nature, and the open circles correspond to the emotional valence for democracy. And you can see from the ANOVA here that everything is significant. Basically, what this tells you is that for nature, there's no difference between younger and older groups in the valence of the concept. Nature tends to have a more positive valence, though we'll see later on that there are qualitative differences. But for democracy, interestingly, the older group has a significantly better emotional valence regarding democracy. So this it's very much reminiscent of what Ricardo was telling us at the beginning of the presentation, which is hold on.
Sergio, sorry.
Yeah.
What's the scale of valence from
1 to 9?
Okay.
9 being very positive and 1 being very negative.
Okay, and so something like 5 is neutral.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is only ordinal, so people will. You have to consider how people are using the scale. So these scales might have floor or ceiling effects. So people not necessarily are going to be using the whole scale. But yeah, I guess in general, it's not that democracy is negatively viewed, probably, but there is a difference by age, which is very reminiscent of what Ricardo was saying about the cohort effect in a young and older population regarding how they value democracy.
Thank
you. For the similarity estimates, we did some cleaning of the data because people who provided 2 words or less in their lists are increasing noise in the data. So we didn't use that. There's a way to getting around this because you can tell people, give me at least 4 or 5 words, and people will do that with that. But in this case, we left it totally open. So some people just produce 1 or 2 words. Not too many people, so we didn't lose a lot of data here. So so we ended with 345 words, useful word lists for democracy and 372 for nature. So what we computed here is the similarity measure, which is basically what it is you standardize list length so the values will go from 0 to 1. And the closer the lists are, the words are in the list, the higher the value that you give them. And then you average across all subjects, and that'll give you a similarity matrix, where 0 means nobody mentioned both words in the same list, and 1 means both words were always listed in direct proximity. And then well, the typical thing that you can do is to heat maps, which is see what words are producing are more highly related, more similar. And then you can do hierarchical clustering, which is very standard in this type of cognitive research. If you do it kind of like in the lab or in experimental settings. This is just to give you a flavor of what you get. This is a heat map for democracy for the group of young participants. And what you see here is that there's an area of high, densely shared semantic space, and then a lot of noise. But we're interested in this shared space, the things that people tend to list together. So it's not like you get only the frequency. You need that these things are repeated frequently, or rather frequently, but you also need that these things tend to come together. So we use this to select. This is pretty much intuitively select those clusters of words that are highly related, but that are more distant, that are distant from other clusters. So this is the area of high density similarities, and we selected arbitrarily 2 or 3 or maybe more, depending on how the graph looks, the best clusters. And then we characterize those. We look which are the words that are clustered that represent a certain group. So if groups are irrelevant, I mean, if old and young people list the same things and pretty much the same clusters, you would find the same or close to the same clusters for both groups. So we were expecting that this will show us different clusters for groups. So this is a semantic map which grabs those words and graphs them. So you can see here that the young group has some things that characterize them and not the other groups. Adults are kind of like in the middle. And then the older group listing for the democracy have some very specific things that they list as a cluster in relation to each other. Here's an example of some of those words. They're in Spanish here in the graph. So for the older group, you have things like peace, diversity, dialogue, education, citizen, and community. This is the things that they are listing in proximity. Not necessarily all of them in proximity, but someone listed peace and diversity, someone else listed diversity, dialogue, and education, and so on. You get the idea. Whereas the younger group listed things like power, majority, decision, law, vote, and president. So it's pretty intuitive to see that the older group is listing things that are values associated with democracy, basically the idea of community, diversity, for example, whereas the younger group is listing things that are more institutional and procedural. So they're listing power, majority, voting, law, president, that kind of stuff. They're not, it's not that they're not listing values, is that they're not listing values in close proximity to each other in their lists. So we're assuming that in their semantic memory, the values associated with democracy are not grouped in a tightly knit cluster. If I'm being clear about this, I'm not. If you have questions, please interrupt. So our interim conclusions is that our data shows that it is possible to discriminate young versus old at a group level in terms of the emotional valence of the concept of democracy. We don't know exactly why this is happening. I mean, it's a cohort effect, but it could be that there's some developmental trend that could explain this, like older people are getting wiser, might be. Or maybe there's some change in brain structure that changes the structure of concepts to incorporate more values and abstractions. So that might also be.
Or Sergio, because
Enrique, yes.
here we have transitioned from a more individualized society in the last 20, 30 years, mainly because, of the changes in economy and so on.
Sure. I mean, you could. That's what we're calling here a cohort effect, which so the circumstances under which people grew up, the older people or grow are close or grew up, the younger people, the circumstances, social and whatever, are different. So might that explain what's happening, and that's sort of like a preferred explanation. But it also might be that younger people will grow older to develop the kinds of concepts that the old people are presenting. Maybe it's not fully or only a cohort effect. There's maybe some developmental factors there too. So that's a possibility. So at face value, if you take the words that we were seeing, like peace, diversity, dialogue, education, citizen, community, and others like tranquility, justice, citizenship, and education, it seems that the older participants were thinking of community much more. If we were going to use an umbrella concept for, so community is the important part of the concept of democracy, whereas the young people didn't show that. So it's possible that those values account for the more positive valence of the older participants. So that, again, that going back to the cohort or developmental effects, that might be a cohort effect, because it might be that education years ago was more when people were taught about democracy, values were emphasized more. So maybe that's what's the difference. We don't know. So I'll show you now that if we have, I don't know how we are in time. Luke, do we have time left?
Yeah, if you want to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, and we can turn to Q&A.
Cool. And so just to show you that for nature we did the same thing. So just to speed up things, this is a semantic map for nature. So we computed valence. We also computed the similarity measure and did the dendrograms and selected the most representative in terms of closely neatly associated words for nature. And you also see differences between young here. This is the typical things that they'll mention, and old, the older group. And what's interesting is that the kinds of things that the older participants mentioned that the younger didn't mention in tight indirect proximity are harmony, beauty, biodiversity, purity, origin, essence, equilibrium, calmness. Again, these things look like values or abstractions, charts with positive emotion. So this is like typical. These associations have been described as humanistic and aesthetic. So in contrast, for the younger and adult participants, the associations are more utilitarian regarding and naturalistic. Like typically people would say nature and they'll say farmland, forest, mountain, green, water, stuff like that. Whereas older people will intersperse things about values in their lists, which will make a qualitative difference between the list of both groups. So again, we can speculate regarding the valence results that these might have to do with the results that Ricardo was mentioning about the opinion polls in Chile and around the world regarding a decrease among younger population of the belief in democracy as a form of government. Because if you have if you think of democracy as a utilitarian thing, which is how to govern a country, then there are no values associated, or if values are less relevant, then that might explain less confidence in democracy as a form of government. I'll just jump. We had a well, okay. I'll try to wrap up as fast as I can, but it seems interesting that all the participants include values in their lists. That this is totally we were not looking for that specifically. So it's we believe that this is what the data is showing, and we can only speculate if these characteristics are responsible for changes in behavior regarding the democracy or regarding nature. In terms of being more prone to ecological actions in favor of nature or ecological concerns. So I mean, we are focusing here in our data only on what's not the common ground. So we characterize groups by what's not the common ground, but it might be that the common ground is between groups, which is not our focus here, is large. And that might watch out any differences between groups. So it's something that we would like to see more in detail. What consequences is the difference that we're detecting here have for behavior, for concrete behaviors. So one thing what we want to do, for example, is to correlate. We can do it right now. We just haven't got to that stage. Correlate the valence results, which are subject by subject, with the opinion poll ratings. So it would be interesting to find that negative valences also are associated with negative judgments relative to democracy as a form of government. There are other limitations and unknowns, but I'll leave them for the question sections if they come up. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Really appreciate that thought-provoking presentation. It's definitely something we, as people who study democracy and use surveys, it's interesting to think about that, and maybe this is something we can incorporate. So we'll take any questions from the audience. You can put your questions in the chat or use the raise hand feature and ask for a question to the presenters live. Yeah, Clifford Zinnes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Fascinating stuff. I actually did a study on the very same topic in Colombia about a decade ago, and developed a very detailed mapping of concepts and aspects for the very same reasons that you were concerned about. But I didn't mean to bring up my work. What I wanted to ask is that two questions. One is what are the, I guess, what are the implications? I mean, other than, do we really want to ask questions about vague topics? I've done studies where, on where you have terminology that you're mentioning as your dependent variable, which does not exist in the real world. Like if you're going to measure GDP, there's a definition for that. But if you're trying to measure, democracy or competitiveness, that these are all very vague notions. So why not, so why not just ask questions of, I mean, I guess, so what's the purpose really of this work other than to know not to use, simple questions for complex ideas? Why not just ask specifically, do you think, we should vote for the president, or do you think we should have, a president for life, or do you think we should have a Supreme Court, 3 branches of government, whatever, very concrete to understand the mechanistic side, or at least use that to correlate with what you're coming up with. And the other question I have relates to valence. Obviously, you've given us a lot of information here, and so I've probably misunderstood. But if there's one thing for sure about Latin America, is that each country has, or even region, has very idiosyncratic understandings of different terms. I wanted to think of some examples, but most of the ones I thought of were kind of vulgar, so I didn't want to say them. But you know what I mean, Ricardo and Sergio, that there's a tremendous variation. So when you're using, so it seemed like when you're using a valence map of 14,000 words, it wasn't clear to me that was from the actual group that you're surveying, and beyond that, it could actually be that valences could be age dependent or dependent on other socioeconomic characteristics that are then coming into your analysis, and you could be misattributing differences to the valence that are actually structural within the valence, and you're misattributing that to differences in the concept of democracy. So I guess I would like to hear what your thoughts are about that, because it wasn't clear how you were going to disentangle the causality here, what to attribute the variation to. So let me stop there, and thank you very much for the time.
So, Ricardo, you want to take a shot at the first question?
I'm not sure, because I was going to ask Luke, are we collecting questions, or is it, or can we just reply immediately and then go on to the next?
Yeah, why don't you reply right now, and then if we get a lot of questions, we can collect them at the end.
Okay. Yeah. What are the implications? The first question. Yeah, I do agree. I believe this tool is very useful for studying abstract concepts or vague concepts, as you said. And the thing is that why not going for a straightforward path is that I feel that sometimes it feels like a straitjacket, in the sense that the researcher has their own idea of what people should think, or I don't know if there are any political scientists here in the room, and I'm truly sorry for what I'm about to say. Sometimes, these political scientists think of these political philosophers, and they think that people understand democracy in the words of, of texts of 18th century, and sometimes that's not the case. People usually don't think on those terms, and sometimes you end up having correlations with let's say constructs of that people actually can, that people actually usually respond to these questions, and even you get you conduct a factorial analysis and you get constructs and you get this idea that people actually think in those terms, but actually they don't. And sometimes the gap between those two is huge. And let me give you an example. We didn't show this today, but in a previous presentation I gave in WAPOR last year, we did that. We presented how these concepts are coming out of these word association tags were completely different from the concepts that you can actually get from a factorial analysis or closed-ended questions, because the researcher imposed this it was the redistributive view of democracy. which didn't show up in our analysis. And that was very interesting because, well, you get the word value survey and you get this, people have this idea of a redistributive view of democracy, but actually it didn't come up in the process, in the word association task. And that's a thing that I think it's valuable, like we're not imposing the concepts of democracy, how people view democracy. And I see it as a value here. And the other thing is the relation between these concepts. One major problem with categorizing responses, even with open-ended questions, is that it forces people's opinions into specific boxes. So you get, let's say, a phrase, two phrases, but again, you don't know how to process that, and you end up forcing, categorizing this into specific boxes. And the thing is that you miss something that is really valuable, which is the relation between these concepts. And the thing is that people can actually have different meanings of democracy, and some of them you don't know them because, well, if you follow the close-ended survey questions, well, you only get what you were trying to pursue, the paper you wanted to write, and that's it. Or if you follow the open-ended question, like the traditional open-ended question, what you get is just the concepts that, again, you're categorizing and you're missing the relations, because sometimes people think like, well, we didn't show this here about the clusters, the number of clusters. In Waper we show it, and in among young people we see like 3 different clusters, and so they have 3 different views of democracy along the same subjects. So and that's fascinating. I don't know why that happens, and I think that's that we have to work more about this, but it's interesting, at least in my view. I'm gonna hand it to Sergio about the balance question.
Yeah, I also didn't mention that valence, if you're asking for single words, there could be contexts where the word valence totally changes depending on the context. But go ahead, please, Sergio.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Clifford. I'll make sure to check your working with Colombia. I didn't know about it. So, yeah, I mean, we are aware of the problems that you're pointing out, and we're interested on trying to see if of finding ways of defining social groups to see if the shared common ground or the shared meaning about something is sufficient, or if there are critical aspects in which meaning diverges in different groups. So the way that we've been doing it is basically defining a social group by some socio-demographic, like where they live in Chile, might be in the north or in the south, and then checking if there are differences in terms of semantic memory, in terms of meaning. But what we really like is to be able to make predictions the other way around, is to see semantic meaning and see, okay, this guy probably belongs to that group, to go the other way around. That would kind of go make ways into your question of causality. I mean, we can't do experiments here, but if we were able to show that semantic memory is different in different groups, and there's some formal way of making predictions about what the difference should be, then that would go some way into understanding better what's really happening. I mean, I totally agree with everything you said about valence and the problem of that of using that measure. We use it because that's the one that's available. So it's kind of like quick and dirty, but totally agree with your suggestions and your critiques.
Thank
and
you.
It's very interesting that you see this match, like you see young people with a negative view of democracy, and you see this negative valence, like relative negative valence among young people. So it was interesting to show, even though that we don't have a full explanation just yet.
Thank you very much.
Liz, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the presentation, as I thought I would. It's really interesting research. I think I'm still looking for a little bit more clarity on the connection to backsliding. So where you start the talk, it certainly not clear from the work whether or not these are just age cohort effects or age cycle effects, life cycle effects. It seems like from the results that you have for nature that the values dimension or whatever you would call it, that sort of that is maybe something that shifts over the course of someone's life. The valence, on the surface looks like something that's different. And I like the use of nature as the comparison. I like that, you show that people have sort of a higher valence for nature, and that makes sense to me. But I wonder, so if what you're capturing is that young people are more cynical about big, lofty concepts, then nature wouldn't get at that, right? Like you might do love or, relationships or something like that. So something that might get at the question I have, which is, if what you're showing with valence is that young people are more cynical, more, sort of more sour, are there other comparisons that we could make to test whether or not that's just a general thing about young people, or if it's really about democracy?
Just sure, Ricardo, maybe you want to jump in, but there is some data that shows that valence is more positive for older people in general, and their life satisfaction is also better for older people than younger people. So there might be some, as you say, life cycle effects here. It's interesting that for nature that's not the case, so it serves as a nice contrast. But yeah, trying to understand if it's a cohort effect, depending on the way the conditions under which you were brought up, and or if it's a life cycle, which is more like the young people are more cynical about these things. We don't know. But what's interesting is that we have the tools to be able to study that. So that's super interesting going into the future. Is something that we would, or at least I would really like to do. Ricardo, you want to jump in?
Just a quick thought. I absolutely agree with you, Liz. We haven't proved that this is a cohort effect. We just showed that young people have different concepts. They understand democracy differently, and those concepts tend to be negative. Like what we showed with this valence analysis. Period. And we would love to conduct a longitudinal study, or maybe do this again a few years later, maybe 10 years later. I don't know if just to check whether this a different cohort or the same cohort have differences, and is it well. But that's it. I mean, but the thing is that it's suggestive. Like it suggests something that is very interesting, at least in my view. So that they have a different concept, and because when you see these numbers, like when in a public opinion survey, and you see that young people value it more or less, you don't know what they mean, and sometimes you can get different meanings, and obviously, if you're interested substantively in this thing, I mean, if you're a political scientist or even a worried citizen, you want to know that. You want to know that underlying this concept there are different meanings, and of course it helps you, to have even for other reasons. Well, in Chile we have had a lot of discussion about democracy over the last 5 years, and so yeah, I mean, it helps you in that way as well. I mean, if you have different meanings of the word, I mean, it would be good, to know, to be straightforward with this and recognize that there are differences, and it helps you to conduct a healthy dialogue, and well, we haven't had that over the last 5 years, sadly, but well, we'll see about the future.
Okay, and we're at the hour, so I think we'll wrap up there. If you have any more questions, you can email me, and then I'll forward your questions to the presenters, if that's
Sure, definitely. We would
that
love to
sounds good.
hear
Yeah,
about so
please.
please do.
Yeah, I have one question, but I'll follow up with you. So
Okay.
yeah. Please join me in thanking our presenters, Drs. González and Chaigneau. Really appreciate this great presentation and a great wrap up to our semester here. So thank you.
Well, thank you
Thank you
for the
very much to all of you.
invitation. Thank you for the questions. Thanks for the attention. And well, have a good day.
Of course, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you again.